Christ is risen. Nothing's quite as it seems, at least with Jesus in the Gospels, but I think it's also true with life. In this particular Gospel, there's this theme that runs through it, among many themes that are there, and this is a theme that actually you will find in all the Gospels. And that is, Jesus is not always appearing to be who he seems to be, or saying what he seems to be saying. And people are often misunderstanding him and what he's trying to say. And some of this is because people are a little bit dense, caught up in whatever biases or kind of modes of thinking, right? They're sort of in a rut in the way that they're thinking about things. But it's also because Jesus is intentionally obscuring what he's trying to say. And he rarely comes out and says exactly what it is that he means to say. There's only a few times he really reveals himself to be the Messiah. One of them is with Peter, but this one is with just some sort of random Samaritan woman, right, at a well. You know, he says, "I am he," right? I mean, he hardly ever does that. We have Jesus sitting at this well, and he's talking to this woman. And what I find amazing is this woman's reaction, because she's called out and exposed for her adultery, right? You know, she's living with some man, and, you know, she's not married to him, and she's had like 5 husbands. And I mean, we don't know if maybe she's like one of these women where every time she gets married, the husband dies, right? Maybe she married a bunch of rich men, right? 5 rich men, and they're all dead. I don't know, right? You can imagine something in this story. But her response isn't sort of like if you or I were sort of called out on the carpet by some man, some random man at the well, right? We might be like, "Who are you?" You know, like, judge yourself. You know, we might have like an attitude. We might get defensive. We might definitely not react in the way this woman did. Often when we encounter sort of insults or conflict like this, we sort of become defensive. We stop listening, right, and being aware of stuff, and we're sort of in a protective mode. She doesn't do this. Her response is one of wonder and awe and, you know, confession of faith. She says, "Oh, you must be a prophet," you know. And she's very sincere in all this. At first, she doesn't quite get it, right? He says, "I'll give you living water." Now, you don't see this in English, but the word for living is the same word for moving water. So, like, that's what you would call a spring, or a river would be living water because it's moving, right? Something's alive, it moves. So she's a little confused at first of what he's talking about, right? She thinks, oh, he's talking about some other spring, and you know, she doesn't quite get it. She's thinking in very material sort of notions. Oh, maybe there's some other well nearby that's like really great, and he's going to show it to me. But that's not what he's talking about. But she eventually gets it, and she realizes he's talking about something spiritual. And she goes back, and what does she do? She then goes and she tells all of her friends and all the people in the village. And the people in the village, they immediately recognize, oh, this must be the Messiah. They take this opportunity. They invite him to stay in the town for a couple days. They want to hear more from him. They could easily have reacted to the same situation differently because Jesus is a Jew, and these are Samaritans. They don't really have much to do with each other. They're kind of at enmity with each other. It's sort of like Palestinians and Jews today in Palestine. It's the same sort of kind of like conflict and hatred. And yet, these Samaritans are able to overcome that and able to see something more in Jesus. They're not blinded by their prejudice in this case. Now, contrast this with the apostles. We just read this. Jesus is sitting there at the well, and they don't say anything, right? But they're totally scandalized, right? It says that they think within their minds, but they don't say anything. No man dares to stop him. They're all really, really concerned about Jesus breaking certain social norms and rules. But they don't realize what he's doing, which is bringing someone to salvation, right? So they see one thing, but they can't see the deeper thing that Jesus is doing in this action. They don't really have the eyes to perceive this. And then Jesus talks to him, and the reason they weren't there is because they went to the town to get food, right? And they come back and they say, have something to eat, Jesus. And he says, you know, I already have, you know, the meat I have, you know, satisfies the soul, or whatever he says, right? He says, you know, I don't need any meat. I have the bread of life, which is everlasting. And they're like, oh, did someone come and bring him food? Right? They don't get it, right? I mean, you and I read it, and I mean, we're kind of cheating, right? We already know the story. So it's a little easy for us to kind of look at the apostles and think they're dummies, but we'd probably do the same thing. They don't get it. They think he's talking about actual bread. They're like, who brought him bread? Why is he not hungry? What's he talking? They don't get that he's talking in metaphors. He's talking spiritually about things. So they don't get it. And they don't get what he's trying to do with the Samaritans, that he's trying to reach out and spread the good news to people beyond the Jews. You recall he says to the woman at the well, neither on your mountain nor in Jerusalem will men worship God, but all men will worship God in spirit and in truth, because God is spirit. That's a paraphrase of that. But it's significant because he's tearing down all these kind of expectations that people have, right? The Jews expect a certain kind of Messiah, and they expect that it's just for the Jews, and they expect that worship is in Jerusalem. And the Samaritans, they have a different mountain and a different holy city, not Jerusalem. And they think that's where the Messiah come, and they have their own expectations of the Messiah, and they have their own expectations of where you worship and how you do it. And Christ is coming, and he's breaking and tearing down all those expectations and biases and assumptions that people have. And this is often what blinds people from seeing Jesus as God and from really understanding what he's trying to say, is that everyone's biases and expectations and assumptions that they have, many which they're not aware of, are so powerfully rooted in them that they're not able to actually hear and see things spiritually. And so this is a common theme. Like, think about the Pharisees in last Sunday's gospel. What happened when right before them a man was healed? What did they complain about? Him picking up his mat and doing work on the Sabbath, right? Missing the point. So this is what I want us to dwell on today, is this idea that it's very easy to miss the point. We can miss the whole point of our lives. We can miss the whole point of interactions that we have, or situations and experiences that we have. We can miss the point. The same way the Pharisees do all the time in the Gospels, the same way the apostles often did. Or we can be like the woman at the well and we can get it. Or like the Samaritans and we can get it. Right? Think of what's the other parable that Christ tells about Samaritans? The Good Samaritan, right? And the Good Samaritan, what? He passes by and he gets it. He gets that this is an opportunity to do good to somebody, right? And who doesn't get it? The priest and the Levite, the Jews, right? They're what? They're busy, right? They're busy. They don't see it. And this is what I think we have to think about, is that the spiritual life is very much about being able to hear and see God present. Because Jesus Christ, through all the experiences, circumstances of our everyday lives, is speaking to us the same way that he spoke to the woman at the well. And the question is, do we see him? Do we hear his voice in all the things that happen in our day? In the insults, in the hardships, in the bad luck, in the conflict and fighting, in the good things, in the beauty around us, in the goodness that someone does, the kindness of a stranger. Do we see God in these things? When we're betrayed, do we blame God, or do we take this opportunity to be mindful of how God was also betrayed? When we're insulted by somebody else, are we defensive, or do we take it as an opportunity to have compassion on someone else and to recognize that when someone is harming us, that they're often the person who's hurt, right? When we have bad luck, do we take it as an opportunity to remind ourselves of what's really important? When we're having hard financial times, is it an opportunity to be mindful of how other people are poor and how really much better we are and how money really doesn't matter? Or is it a time when we get angry and anxious and upset? See, anything we run into, the voice of God is speaking to us in some way, right? In very sort of subtle ways, because really life is just a series of riddles thrown at us. And God speaks to us in the riddles of our lives. And we can interpret it. We can have sort of the eyes to see it. Or as Jesus says often in his Gospels, he who has ears, let him hear. And the reason in the Gospels and in our own lives that Jesus often speaks obscurely and in riddles and in parables. You know, the word parable means riddle. That's what it means. Is that he wants us to do some